Today, I am joined by Dominic DeMartine. Dominic, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, a couple weeks ago, you reached out to me asking about my view on morality. And throughout our multi-day text conversation, we seem to have been talking past each other just a little bit. So, for this conversation, I want to start off by just giving my view the same way I told you over text, and then try to understand where you and I disagree. Does that sound like a plan?
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
So, I view morality in a very similar way to how many people view health. Now, whenever someone is diabetic, you and I would probably agree that's indicative of not being healthy. You and I would probably agree that broccoli is a more healthy food than donuts. And the way we do that is truly by positing a set of claims about what health is. We might say health is living longer. We might say health is preventing illness, things like that. But all of these things we posit are seemingly intuitive to everybody. They are, in some sense, obvious, right? We all know what health looks like. We all know that morbid obesity is not the status quo for a healthy person. So I look at morals the same way. I say, whenever you murder an innocent child on the street, that is immoral, as you and I would agree. In a similar vein, I would say that doing a good deed, an act of kindness for a stranger, an elderly stranger, is a moral thing to do. And in the same way as us positing different ways of understanding health, you would have to posit well-being, right? The promotion of well-being and the reduction of harm as this, in my view, obvious foundation for objective morality. So in this sense, you have a substrate of morality that is clearly true. We all intuitively know or are in the pursuit of understanding morals by understanding how to increase the well-being of those around us and ourselves, potentially. In the same way that we know that increasing our health can be done by eating vegetables and not eating donuts. That's my view of morality. Where do you disagree?
So I am called what philosophers call a cultural relativist. So I believe that morality is relative to the culture that you're in. So if I'm in a tribe of cannibalists, I'm going to view that cannibalism is moral. But if I'm in a different culture where I see cannibalism as grotesque or immoral, then therefore that action would be immoral. So where I think that you have, or we come to a disagreement, is you believe that there is some kind of standard or some kind of measurement that we can measure whether something's immoral or not. I disagree in that facet because I feel like morality cannot be measured. There is no objective truth. There's no scale of determining what is right or wrong. It is simply what we can do with our own moral compass. And that's where I believe relativism comes in, where it doesn't matter whether or not something is moral or immoral, because I can say that, sure, we can agree that murder just generally is a bad thing. But as soon as you add on like little tiny subsets to that, where it's, murder to help 5 children, right? And then you get into some gray area, or you can even make murder even good, where it's like, you know, murder a mass murderer, right? So you're taking one life to save a bunch of lives, and that would be seen as virtuous or moral. So that's kind of where I stand.
So let's look at this comparison about health then, because for whatever reason I find it quite compelling. Does that mean you're also a health relativist? So if I said broccoli or donuts, you spend your whole life eating broccoli or your whole life eating donuts, and maybe some multivitamin here or there to make sure you get your essential nutrients, let's say. Would you not agree with me that eating broccoli is objectively better for you?
I would agree, but there's a numeric standard called calories that determines whether or not something is healthy or unhealthy. The same way that you can facet in, exercise or other things. So if there was some kind of like caloric system that we could do to implement within our moral compass, right? Then sure, I would say that, morality might be objective in that sense. But there isn't like a point total where it's like, you littered, so therefore you have a negative caloric moral outtake, or you give to charity, then you have an increase in points. I think as cool as the concept, I don't know if you've seen the Good Place or not. As cool as the concept seems, I don't think it's realistic, right? There is no point total. There is no action that we can deem with a standard like we can with calories.
But wouldn't it still be the case that if we didn't have a measurement, that your argument that you're saying now would still be the case? That you would still say, okay, I think broccoli, or I know broccoli is healthier than donuts. And imagine we're in a world where we don't know that calories exist. We don't know that macros exist. Does that mean in that world broccoli is no longer healthier?
That's exactly the point. And I know that might seem absurd at first, but like let's take for example, the time before the calorie system was actually standardized. People who were obese was seen as healthy or more attractive because they had enough food to sustain themselves. They were seen as people who were in better standing than others. And in every facet, they were seen as a healthier human being. Now that we have more scientific research, right, behind the caloric value system, we're able to kind of put a numeric system on health. Whereas with morality, even if we have massive scientific like endeavors to try to research some kind of numeric system to dictate whether something's good or bad, I don't think that's realistic. I don't think we're ever going to be into that point of a scientific breakthrough where we're actually able to come up with point totals to the exact decimal of whether an action is good or bad.
Here's a point I think is worth delineating, though, because you would be right to say that in days old, if you were overweight, for example, you would appear healthier or appear better off because you had, you were better fed or something in a scarce environment. But we have to delineate, I would claim, between perception and reality, because you would be right again in saying that people were perceived as healthier, but those same people probably didn't live very long and had heart problems and blood clots and whatever else, what other health conditions. And then in a similar vein, to apply that to morality, you could say, well, yes, at one point in history, slavery was viewed as okay, to go to extremes here. But does that mean slavery was actually okay because it was perceived as okay? Or is there a deeper, more fundamental truth? I say it's well-being, but it could be anything. A more deeper understanding that would say no. In the same way that morbidly obese people were unhealthy even if we didn't have calories. Slaves were being mistreated, and the actions towards them were immoral, even if we don't have a quantifiable measurement for studying this.
Right. So I think the variable that kind of differentiates like the analogy from morality is the fact of awareness, right? With slavery, we were starting to gain awareness of the harms that it caused. We understood how it harmed the people who were oppressed by slavery. And the same facet goes to, obesity in the like early 1700s, right? Even though they were perceived as healthy or, good citizens, the objective thing is that we didn't have an awareness to where that like obesity was a problem. And so I don't think we'll have any kind of standard to measure morality in an awareness sense, right? I don't think we can develop an awareness that puts on some kind of high clarity, right, to figure out if something's good or bad. I might be wrong, but right now we don't really have the means to that, right? So it's up to anyone's best guess to what is right and what is wrong. Objectively, if there were hypothetically some kind of awareness or clarity to dictate whether something's right or wrong.
So then, to really pin this down, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Are you saying then that since at one point in history it could be argued that Europeans were not aware of the harm they were causing, and other people would argue that they were aware and just saw profit as a bigger motive, so it depends on who you ask. But hypothetically, if they were not aware, to use your example, does that mean mistreating vast numbers of people is not able to be defined as immoral? You couldn't say that's immoral.
Okay, so here's the interesting part of this, right? So I say that awareness is a key factor in determining whether or not something is objectively right or wrong, or or obese or slim, right? But the awareness part gives us the clarity to determine objectively that is right or wrong. Now, if you didn't have the awareness, right? Because I have a firm belief that everyone usually tries to think of themselves or do the right thing, right? And seeing people, I guess like seeing slaves work for you, they weren't really seen as human, right? They were seen as animals, right? They were seen as inferior. So it was morally permissible to treat them in that facet, not because they understood the harms that they were causing to that person, or that the fact that they weren't aware it makes it objectively permissible. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying that like objectively slavery is impermissible in most cases. The reason why I use most cases is because you can obviously add on so many subtext, right, to make it permissible, where you're like, oh, if everyone had a immensely better standard of living, and the world was perfect, or I could add on so many subtexts, for example, that might make slavery permissible, but in the sense of the historical lens, I would say that would be impermissible by our current standard of living, right? Our current standard of social awareness. So right now we're able to say that at least the majority of the world, right, can say slavery is impermissible, right? And we know that it's wrong and that people are people and not things, not property, right? And so I guess, does that kind of like answer your question there?
It does, but it also makes me wonder a new question. So if I hear you right, you're saying that let's say the slave owners, they viewed slaves as chattel, or something like that. And in that sense, based on that awareness, then it was deemed moral in some sense because of their perception. Just to clarify, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm saying, like, in their eyes, they're seeing that, owning a slave wasn't that bad. It's kind of like the same facet where we think that, owning pets is morally permissible, right? Do you have any pets at home, actually?
I used to. I don't at this point.
But do you think that it's morally permissible for you to own a pet?
It seems okay.
Right. So now let's say 50 years down the road, we get this awareness that actually owning a pet can is super detrimental, super immoral, right? And if it's easy to say, looking back, that was completely horrid, inhumane, whatever, right? But the thing is that people of that time had no awareness, so therefore they only really cared about perceptions. Perceptions is the best way that we can kind of gain or weigh like moral standards, right? If we want to be seen as a morally permissible person, we don't litter. We try to recycle. We try to, work. We try to treat everyone with some kind of facet of respect, right? And that's how we focus on trying to be morally permissible or act morally permissible, where we try to do things that have a better or positive impact on our perceptions. That's kind of like what I'm saying here.
So that brings two things to mind. I'm going to go in reverse order, I suppose. On one hand, firstly, the pet example, I think this is where you and I really disagree at the core. I would say that if we learn in 50 years that it's actually immoral to have had pets, that wouldn't mean it was moral 50 years prior to have owned them. It just means we didn't know it was immoral. That's my first thought. And then a similar thought would be that to that slave owner example, just because this is an easy extreme to understand the argument, while yes, you could say the slave owner didn't realize it, if that's what historians think to be accurate, but wouldn't the slave know it's immoral? I mean, and this is actually a human. We know this is a human. We can look at the genealogy. You could say, well, the slave owner doesn't think they're human. Well, the slave does. The person who is owned thinks it's immoral. So does that mean there are two sets of morality? The person being owned has a set of morality that the owner is not required to follow. They are two separate moralities.
I think that's an interesting point there, and I feel like I'm unqualified to kind of have an input because I don't know what the person was thinking at the time. I think it's kind of one of those things where it's like where racism exists in our world, and that's just a reality, right? It's unfortunate, it sucks, but it happens. I think that if looking back, I think that's how slaves viewed slavery, where it's just an unfortunate truth. There isn't really much that you can do besides run away or comply, right? And so in that facet, I think that there is definitely two different moral standards. And that's why I'm a cultural relativist, where it's like there are some cultures who are aware of what is immoral ahead of time, and there are some cultures that don't. And I feel like that lack of awareness does not make someone a good or bad person. It just means that they were simply just trying to be perceived, right, and doing the best that they can with their knowledge to be a good person.
And the way you describe this, interestingly, sounds very similar to how I think of morality. So I want to sort of restate what I think to see, again, where we disagree, because I agree with you, and I maybe didn't make this clear, that day-to-day life, certain individuals, cultures, societies, points in history, and so on, could have a better understanding of ethics, right? They could be further down this road, if you will. But I actually have no disagreement there. My claim is that yes, all of those things happen through our logic and our reasoning and our intuition and our empathy and all of these things that are innate within us. We are simply getting closer to understanding a substrate, a objective reality. We are just approaching that line. And it sounds like what you're saying is very similar, that, okay, at one point they didn't have an awareness of this morality, and then they learned, okay, we can't treat slaves this way because they're human. And then you learn farther down the line, we don't have an awareness that racism is a problem. And then you learn, actually, we can't be racist. It seems that you and I are actually saying something very similar. So where do we actually disagree here?
So how I view objective morality is a statement of fact, right? And while you can obviously know that like scientific facts change all the time. For example, the Earth was thought to be flat. Now we know that it to be round. I mean, some people might disagree with that, but objectively, we can say the Earth is round. We have scientific proof. We have eyewitnesses. We have testimonies, and we have mathematical evidence that the Earth has a curvature. Right. So seeing that we have all of those tangible evidence, we can affirm that the statement is true, that the Earth is round. But if we're taking a moral statement, right, slavery is morally permissible, right, as like the old view, right? And then you learn that slavery's okay, or okay is actually wrong. That statement isn't right. So you might think of that as kind of like a similar issue, but the thing is that even though, right, people, believe that, slavery is wrong, there are still cultures that believe that slavery is permissible, right? And you can take the Uyghur camps in China, for example. You can take some other cultures that I don't have too much knowledge of. There's a couple in the Middle East where I think they have some ethnic groups that are in concentration camps that are doing work for free, which is the definition of slavery. But the thing is that I think it's a different standard, right? Kind of like how we have a standard of living. And sometimes we can regress on that, right? When we make a scientific observation that's known to be true, right? We never really go back on it. Like we can go over and say that, oh, this rock is indefinitely 100 years old, right? And then, you can check, every single scientist, and they'll be like, yep, that is 100 years old using our standard of measurement, right? But when you take other examples such as like alcoholism, right, where that was seen as permissible for a very long time, and then we've kind of like juggled around the issue quite a bit, right, where even the United States completely banned alcohol and then reinstated it as legal. Hell, even marijuana, right? So we've kind of gone back and forth of these things, right? But we have no scientists. We don't have any experts to really go over and dictate whether something is to be factually true, right? So I guess that's kind of where we differ, where it's, I think, objective facts, right, stay facts, and we can continue to prove them. Sure, our theories might be different, but when we're saying that this is known to be objectively true, it means by our current standard of measurement, this is 100% true. It means it doesn't matter what anyone else says, this is true. We know it to be true. But I just don't think we can do the same with morality.
Well, I would say something slightly different about scientific objective truths, because Well, let me just ask you this so I don't misunderstand you. Is it not objectively true that even before we could measure it, the Earth was round?
Sure.
So then it wouldn't matter if you could measure it, if all of the scientists agreed. The Earth was round objectively. We just didn't know it yet. So, in the similar vein, slavery very well, and I would argue was objectively wrong. They just didn't know it yet.
I mean, I guess that's a good point, but the issue of that matter is that regardless of how our current standard is, there's still communities that and widespread knowledge that points to the opposite, that slavery is permissible, right? And since those cultures believe that it is 100% permissible, right? And we are like Western cultures, we believe that slavery isn't definitely wrong. There's a heavy disagreement on that. There is something to be debated, right? And so therefore you can't objectively say something is right or wrong. The same thing goes for is nuclear energy good, right? There's no, even though we have the capable measurements, right? We cannot determine whether nuclear is good or bad. So therefore we can't say that nuclear is objectively good, and we can't say nuclear energy is objectively bad. It is a debatable fact, right? The same thing can be said for slavery. While I obviously oppose slavery, right, and as most of my Western peers would also agree with me, there's still a lot of debate that can be had on this topic of slavery, even though the majority of the world can say, objectively, slavery should be wrong, right? It's just that we don't have a total full understanding or agreement that it is impermissible.
So then is it not true to say that we can't say the Earth is round then, to use this example again, because there is a surprisingly large, in my view, community of people who would say, well, no, the Earth is flat. I've gone to these observatories, I've made the measurements myself, and I say it's flat. Now, personally, as a human, I would say, well, these individuals have done the measurements wrong, but there is a community who says the Earth is flat, or even a much larger community, at least in America, often because of more conservative Christian belief that says the Earth is somewhere in the order of 6,000 to 10,000 years old. All of the scientific evidence, geological, biological, anthropological, and so on, indicates that no, the Earth is older than that. But some large and surprisingly large minority of America would say, I disagree. So then, using that same argument you're making, if I'm hearing you correctly, we couldn't say the Earth is older than 10,000 years old. We could only say this is a debate happening right now. And hopefully we someday can say that the Earth is old.
Right. But here, I mean, you froze a little bit during that, but from what I think I could make out what your point was. But the thing is with a large community, right, saying that the Earth is flat, and I totally agree with you. It's a very surprising amount. The obvious fact is that we have a way to disprove it, right? We have measurements. We have the ability to go to space. We have the ability to go to the moon, that can have a clear, objective viewpoint of the Earth and the fact that it is round, right? There's a lot of different mathematical ways we can prove that the Earth is round, but the main reason why we know for 100% sure that the Earth is round is because we have a way to disprove the people who say that it's flat, right? Now, if I went over and said, slavery is morally permissible, how do you prove me? how numerically or systematically or in any facet, how can you prove to me that murder is or slavery is permissible or impermissible? Sorry.
Are you asking me right now, or is this rhetorical?
No, I'm asking you right now.
Well, I would say, because of this foundation that I think all humans can intuitively posit, like health, that is well being promotion, that slavery not only does not promote the well being of conscious creatures, it actively and intentionally eradicates that well being. It harms individuals. It takes away their ability to be prosperous. It takes away their ability to be happy in many cases. And using that same intuition you could have about health, I would say the same thing. And I would also say that, again, not to beat a dead horse, but the example about a flat earth, I think we just disagree that it doesn't take being able to measure the earth as a way to disprove its flatness, but rather the earth could be round, and in fact has always been round, without us having the ability to measure it. It wasn't once we had the ability to measure that it became round. We just now have a better way to prove it. So in the same vein, I'm saying that slavery is bad, right? It's a bad thing to enslave somebody. And we might have better and better ways to prove that through dialogue, through progressivism, through conversation, through cultural shifts. But that in the exact same parallel as the earth always being round, slavery was always bad. We're just learning more and more about how to understand how bad it is.
Right, but the thing is that there's no physical way to observe that the Earth is round without using science or math. Right, it's physically impossible. There's no way of you knowing. So everyone can like take a pin and a guess, right, and just see if it's objective or not. But if you have no way to observe it, how do you know something is morally permissible or impermissible? With the fact of slavery, right? If you were to ask one of the cultures, right, that enact slavery, it would be the equivalent of stepping on an ant to feed a family, right? If I'm on a farm and I have a family of 10, right, and I'm trying to, live wage by wage, and I have slavery, it significantly improves my life. And since the slave owner in this analogy, if I the slave owner enact slavery, right, and if I am the participant in the slavery system, right, and I have a slave who I view as, less than an ant or the equivalent of an ant, right, that gets me to have free labor so that way I can provide for my family, right? I would see that as morally permissible. Doesn't matter how you can argue, right, whether or not that slavery has harm, or even trying to convince me that the slave is a person, right? No matter what you say, I will not believe that that person is a person, right? So that's where slavery becomes such a debating topic, right? That's where there's so much dissent, because we do not have a way to know the objective truth. If there was an observable way, right, where we can show people, right, physically, like how the earth is round, how we can physically show them, there's no way we can say for certain whether something or is or isn't moral, right? Hopefully that makes sense.
I think I'm hearing you, but again, I think we value different points here, because I care less about how well we can convey what's the most moral, although I think that is important. In the same way, I care less about how much we can convey the Earth's roundness. What I think I'm having trouble agreeing with you on, and I want to really pin this down to make sure we actually are saying different things. It sounds like you're saying, again, you have to be able to measure to prove like there's a quantifiable way to say something's more moral. But to say the same thing about anything else in our world, like the Earth is round, whether we've measured it or not. It is round. We don't have the ability to measure it yet. We don't know of a quantifiable way yet. Imagine we didn't have a quantifiable way. The Earth would still be round.
Here's where I'm going to interject real quickly. And I think this will be the driving point here.
Sure.
Is that, sure, you can say that the Earth is round, right? We 100% know it. It's true regardless. But a human living on the planet Earth without knowing that the Earth is round, right? In a standard that, can't be disproven, right? Cannot say objectively the Earth is round because they don't know. There's physically no way that they can know. If there's no science, no math, you cannot say that the Earth is objectively round. You might be right, you might be wrong, but no person on that planet can for 100% for sure say that the Earth is round because they can't prove or disprove it.
Well, that really is the point where we disagree then, because I would say, we agree that they couldn't say it with 100% confidence. We both agree with that level.
It would be a lucky guess to say objectively the Earth is round.
It would, and we agree on that. But the distinction is, it doesn't matter whether or not their confidence level is 98%, 99%, or 1%. The Earth is still round. So then you're right, it would be difficult if you only have a 1% confidence in saying that slavery's bad, right? It might not be a 99% confidence. I would go as far to say we can't say much of anything with 100% confidence just because of how many weird discoveries in quantum physics that I can't quite intuit. But edge cases aside, we may even agree that you can't say with 100% confidence that slavery was bad if you don't have enough information. Like if you don't know that they're humans, right? We can agree to that. You might only have a 5% confidence that it's bad, and it's just a lucky guess at that point. But that doesn't mean it's not bad.
Then let me point this out then. So we can prove that there is a downward force pulling into Earth's core. There's no extra knowledge that we need to understand that exists, right? For example, apple in English, we know without having to have any additional discoveries, right? We know that we should call that object an apple, right? So the difference there, right, is that there's no more discoveries. There's no more anything like that. We know for 100% certain that those things exist, right? But when the thing is, when you say that objectively something is right or wrong, it is the exact same as trying to say that, I think an apple is an apple. That's as much as saying that. I mean, it's just as much truth as saying slavery is wrong, right? It doesn't have a lot of weight to it. Sure, you can just say it, but it's not meaningful because there's no way to know that truth, right? There's no systematic way that we have right now to be able to discover if something is right or wrong. And that's where my opinion is, right? Where it's like, yeah, sure, you can say objectively, my eyes are green. I'm wrong, and that statement's meaningless. Now, if I said, my eyes are objectively brown, again, meaningless, but right. The difference is that we we can observe scientific truths, but we can't observe moral truths.
Okay, so that's a really good clarifying point because now I can at least grasp that we're talking the same language. We can agree on what truth means and foundational claims. So then the question is, to your point, can you prove with any kind of evidence, let's just say generally, that something can be shown to be immoral or ethical or unethical or moral, right? That's our disagreement here then. And this ties back into my claim about health. There's no way to, and maybe you agree here, which would surprise me, but maybe you actually agree here. There's no way to say health is X, Y, or Z. It's not being diabetic. It's eating your vegetables, whatever, without having some kind of basis. Even someone who believes in a subjective understanding of morality, of health, you would agree with that. The distinction I'm making is that, well, health we didn't arbitrarily define necessarily. We didn't arbitrarily say, oh, if you're over 400 pounds, you're healthy. We didn't say if you can't walk right, you're healthy, because those sound like stupid claims, right? Our natural understanding of reality, our intuition, our whatever you want to call it, something I would call this substrate of understanding of the world, it indicates to us that no, health is something like, and maybe the edge cases haven't been worked out yet. Maybe there's gray area. Maybe if you eat too many vegetables, you get an illness. I mean, maybe that's possible. But we kind of understand that vegetables are generally good. Donuts are generally bad. Exercise in moderation, especially cardio, is generally helpful for heart health. And in the same way, you could certainly make this distinction that I don't know that I have a good answer for in terms of the is-ought distinction, that you can't absolutely draw the bridge between these parameters we define health as. But I'm saying that this is already exists. We're just discovering it. And in the same way, a basis for morality, an objective morality, also already exists. We might not know if, at least at one point in history, if treating a person a certain way, let's say treating them poorly, is more or less moral. In the same way, we didn't know that eating donuts was more or less healthy. But eventually, we learned it to be. And everyone agrees on that. So I don't see why the jump, the distinction is any harder to say, well, actually we're learning that well-being is the obvious, intuitive, foundational understanding of morality, and these are different ways that we're learning to promote well-being or to stop the reduction of well-being. And again, edge cases, we might not have a perfect solution. The same goes for health. But we have this understanding that there is an objective landscape, if you will, and we are discovering it along the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I would kind of disagree with you on the premise that there is no arbitrary standard for health. I disagree with that because I think for health, we kind of have an end goal with that, right? A healthy person tends to live longer, right? So to be or to act like a healthy person, you are trying to elongate your life. So that means eating vegetables to gain vitamins that your body needs to function at a very pure source, tends to lead to longevity and it's, I guess it wouldn't just be elongating your lifespan, but it's also the comfortability of living. For example, like smoking, sure, you can like live as long as you want, but if you're smoking, you're going to have to be living with tubes in your mouth, right? To try to get you in like the right amount of oxygen, right? That wouldn't be considered, a comfortable standard of living. So I think I think it's kind of like a multifaceted kind of approach with health.
Sure.
Where you have an end goal of trying to be trying to live comfortably throughout your life, and also trying to expand that life itself. But I don't really see any kind of like end goal, right, with morality. And so I think that's where I kind of draw the distinction between health and morality.
Well, to that point, then, we say a longer life, a more comfortable life, maybe a life where you have more mobility, whatever, is healthier because that's obvious, right? Like we say, yeah, that's obviously what health means to us. We're thoughtful, conscious creatures, and that is health. I mean, we all know what that looks like intuitively, right? So why is that any different than saying, okay, beating up your neighbor for no reason, that's obviously immoral. And there might be multifaceted, like health. The end goal could be flexible, like health. Maybe it's living a certain length life, but also living a certain level of comfort. Well, I want to live a certain level of happiness and be treated with a certain level of respect and not be enslaved, for example. That's the same premise, and it's using that same seemingly obvious foundation of objective reality that we're still discovering along the way.
So for I guess like kind of just so that I'm pinning you right here. So your opinion of how health is related to morality is the fact that the end goal is to be happy and respected, right?
Well, I don't think they're necessarily related. I just think the line of thinking is potentially the exact same. That we have goals in life that are intuitive to us. We're humans. We know what health looks like. And in the same way, we are humans. We're intuitive. We know what well-being and morals look like. We know intuitively, in the same way we know what health looks like, what morality can look like. And yes, sometimes we learn along the way, and I don't pretend that's not the case. That's why I think of it as let's say a foundation to a house. That's your objective morality. You could call it your objective truth in science too. And as you learn more about science, you pick away at the floorboards until you can approach that objective truth in science. In the same way, you can pick away at the floorboard and understand that empathy and different skills allow you to better promote well-being. So you're picking away until you realize, okay, this is the floorboard, and we're getting a better understanding of that.
So here's kind of where I kind of differ from this. First off, with health, right? If we were to take a healthy person and an unhealthy person and remove all of their symptoms and observable conditions, right? We wouldn't be able to tell which one's healthier, which one's unhealthier, right? We can learn about their actions, but as soon as we permanently take away the observable symptoms, we won't know the difference between a healthy person and an unhealthy person, regardless of their actions, right? The only thing that we could really do would be to take each action and be like, well, smoking leads to, a little bit, you're a little bit more angry. You have to go out more frequently to actually, smoke, or, it smells kind of bad, that therefore smoking's bad. But besides that, you can't really say that smoking's unhealthy in that sense, right? So that's where we know that health is arbitrary and objective, because we have set standards to observe a healthy person and an unhealthy person. But unlike health, we don't have a way to observe a immoral person and a moral person besides prison. And that is just a system of the law, which people say is subjective. There are some laws that are insanely subjective. Like, for example, laws against marijuana, right? We know that to be racist, right? We know that to be horrible, right? It affected a lot of communities, and it targeted a racial group, right? But if we went over and specifically targeted people in prison and just said all of them are immoral, then we would say that those people who were unjustly imprisoned were immoral people, which is just false, right? So we don't, other than prison, we don't really have an observable way to see if something's right or wrong, other than how people interact with each other. And that I think is so subjective, because for one person, someone might enjoy a slap in the face just randomly out of the blue. They'd be saying, like, if you had an extreme optimist, you'd be like, wow, that was the wake up call that I needed. Or, versus like someone else in general, if you just got slapped in the face, of course you'd be upset and you would try to confront them. And then you have another person who would just not even talk about it at all because they don't like conflict. So the thing is that you have so many different interactions that you can't really weigh if an action is good or bad, right? Only you can, right, with your own personal moral compass, decide if an action is good or bad based on that interaction that you had. We can't really say, we can't really observe an action to be good or bad, for example, just by looking at the total of interactions and seeing that, oh, generally people don't like being smacked in the face, so maybe you shouldn't smack people in the face, right? Then that would leave out the people who do like getting smacked in the face just occasionally, right? So that's kind of where I'm the cultural relativist, because in some cultures, right, it's okay to like kiss people on the mouth, specifically like Europe, and that's like a formal greeting. In America, you don't try that like at all, because you'd be seen as a psychopath, right? So seeing that we get different interactions from different cultures, we have different perceptions on certain actions, and therefore the only way that we can observe it is skewed.
I have two comments. I'm going to say the first quickly in hopes of not forgetting the second, and then we can come back to it. The first is that, and this is something I've briefly mentioned to you off the air, I would say that in something where it's not as extreme as slavery, something where it's a cultural difference, like where you're allowed to kiss somebody for a greeting, or if you're allowed to at all, I would call that equivalencies in morality. Equivalencies, different, to use someone like Sam Harris's landscape, those are equally moral actions because they are equally not harming somebody. Because in one place, you're kissing someone and they're expecting a kiss, and in one place, you're hugging someone and they're expecting a hug. So I'd view those as equal. And I do want to come back to that, but I don't want to forget my other point of, you mentioned this example with health again, just because that's a little easier for us to understand. You mentioned that if two people are of different levels of health, but we didn't have any external symptoms to measure, we couldn't say one's less healthy than the other. I would disagree with that, because if one of them has a heart that's going to die in 2 weeks and one of them has a heart that's going to keep pumping, well, maybe
but that's the thing, is that there's no observable standard. There is no heart. There. Like, let's say someone is an avid smoker and someone is not, right? But there isn't any underlying health conditions that we can observe. The fact that you pointed out the heart, that's an observable standard that we can measure, right? With morality, we don't have that. So I'm sorry, I had to just kind of like interject there.
Well, I'm glad you did. And that's, again, where I think we disagree then, because I would say the opposite. I would say that in the same way that we could measure someone's heart, we could measure someone's BMI, although that's a pretty problematic measurement. But you can measure BMI, you could measure longevity of life, you could measure how many strokes they've had, right? To your point, these are all measurable things. Well, I would say you could do the exact same thing with morals, right? We're measuring someone's heart to determine whether or not it fails, because we all can intuit that a failing heart is unhealthy. And I would say that we can measure how much people are enslaved, for example, because we can all intuit that slavery is immoral. The exact same deductive reasoning.
Right, but the thing is that it's the fact that it's a lot easier to observe a failing heart when it's a failing heart, right? The doctors who can see the pain, right? See and the patient themselves suffering, right? But someone who's across the globe, not even seeing the patient, right? Um, and saying, not really being around heart failures, can say like very ignorant statements of saying, heart failure is no big issue. It's no big deal. I don't really get the linkage, right? The same thing can be said about slavery, right? People who are slave owners can ignorantly say, "Oh yeah, slavery's great," but they're not the ones who are observing the slaves. They're not the ones who are the slaves themselves suffering through that, right? They only see what is observable to them.
Let me interject then.
Profit.
Let me interject then, because that's the key disagreement then, because I do say, it doesn't matter that the person overseas is ignorant about heart failure. The heart still failed, and the person was still unhealthy, whether or not that person overseas knew about it, right? So in the same way, the slave is still being mistreated. It's still being treated immorally, whether or not the slave owner knew it yet.
Okay, that is a good point. I get what you're saying now. I kind of lost track there a little bit. But the thing is that the whole point with slavery, right, and morality, as I've already said, is that since it's not observable, there's no way to know it, right? In the slave owner's eyes, they're acting permissibly. In the slave's eyes, they're acting impermissibly. But how do we tell which one's right? If you don't know the net harms of slavery, like if there was like a tangible evidence to determine whether slavery was good or bad, and all signs point to bad, right? That slave owner, no matter what we do, we wouldn't be able to say, hey, me owning a slave is a bad thing, right? The slave owner would still commit to slavery and participate in the slave system, right? But the underlying fact is that we don't have tangible evidence or results like we do with health. So there's not really a way of knowing, right? It's kind of like we have to close our eyes and just start picking what is right and wrong based on our own experiences. And that's where I think that it's more relativist, because there's no really objective standard that we can use to observe this. And that's kind of like what I've been kind of saying all along. But it's extremely hard to figure out these kind of like moral truths without having a standard, right?
So I think I'm understanding you right, but this is just a point of disagreement we must have, because I think there is evidence towards understanding that slavery is bad. Like the health example, just using this parallel to keep our thoughts in order. In the same way that we can measure the heart, right? You'd consider that a measurable thing, and we would agree on that.
It's tangible, yeah.
Right, it's tangible. Where we disagree is, I would say that measuring someone's, measuring someone's pain is tangible, and it happened. It's part of experience, right? It might not be part of the physical world, but it's certainly part of the experiential world, right? You're experiencing pain. That's measurable in some sense. Maybe we don't know what the measurement is yet, but to say we can't measure it yet, therefore it's a blur. Well, no, we know that punching someone in the face is probably more painful than petting them gently on the back, right? So that's a measurable thing, even if we don't have a way to quantifiably define how we measure it.
Here's where I'll interject, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that I think that there is definite ways to measure pain and all of that, but I think using pain to dictate whether something's right or wrong, or using it as a measurement, is not a very good system of measurement, because let's say, for example, punching someone in the face and patting them on the head, right? For most people, sure, right? We can all kind of observe that, but like with people with certain disorders where if you pet them, it causes them extreme pain, like for some skin conditions or even burn victims, right? If you tap them lightly, it's probably even more severe of a pain than punching, right? Another facet is with slavery, right? You're still in the same lens of saying that slave owners thought of slaves as people. They didn't, right? It's the equivalent of stepping on an ant, right? If you step on an or you peel off a leg off of an ant, you're not going to be like, oh no, I just really hurt an ant. I just did something impermissible. It's like it's an ant. Who cares, right?
Well, I want to clarify my point then.
Right there, you're shortening up the measurement, right? So you're using a shorter ruler, right,
Mm-hmm.
than someone who can stand outside, right? That's kind of where my point is.
Well, pain was just an example because I agree with you that there's complexities to health. For example, caloric intake is just one example. And to use the argument you're just saying about pain, well, there are cases where pain is actually not the best measurement. Well, there's also cases where calories are not the best measurement. Some people are heavier than other people. Some people are on different diets. Some people have other organ issues, whatever. So, to your earlier point about health, I would agree that it's multifaceted, as you would say. Well, we agree on that. But morality would then be the same. I use well-being as an umbrella term, but pain is just one of those facets, right? So in the same way that vitamins, getting your nutrients, are a facet of health, unless one of them has negative side effects if you take too much of it. Okay, well, pain, generally speaking, is also something you don't want, unless there are edge cases in which having not enough of it is a problem, right? So then pain would be one of those things. Mental health, however you want to define that, could be another. Psychological well-being, happiness, things that are not easy to measure yet. I agree with you there. But we're getting more and more indicators of how to measure them. And it is certainly multifaceted. Let's go to extreme case. Let's add a little 13 to this PG conversation. Pain. There's going to be some people who are interested in, domination, right? Okay, well, that person wants pain in their life. Okay, well, that means pain is not the only measurement. And that's, again, why I think of it as more of a landscape, because there are these different variables that, when aggregated in different ways, lead to a aggregate score, if you want to use that language, because I know that's an easy way for us to both conceptualize how much well-being something is or isn't promoting. Okay, so to this person, a certain level of pain would not be as damaging, right? You and I would agree to that. So then you have to take into other factors. In the same way in health, you have general rules of thumb, like generally you don't want to hurt people, but also there's going to be other factors to account for edge cases.
That's true. But I think the issue that I have with that specific way of measurement is the fact that you don't you won't always get the same answer, right? And the way that you're measuring definitely is highly dependent on the individual rather than the action itself, right? You're measuring whether an action is good or bad based on the individual affected, right? And that means that easily I could alter the situation and say there are two different victims and both of them feel different pain, but you can value each of those victims differently based on their, I guess, their place or role in the certain action. For example, if I were to, if I was a, let's say, 90-year-old man who's like on the verge of death, right? And I, push over a kid and indirectly kill myself, right? That would be seen as like the action of me pushing the kid, right, would be seen as bad. But the fact that well, actually, I probably should rephrase that. Let's say that there's three people in this scenario, because now I'm kind of like rethinking this a little bit more. It's kind of hard to come up with these things on the spot. So there's three people, right? There's the kid, me, the 90-year-old man, and then another person. So let's say me, the 90-year-old man, pushes the kid, right? You're going to say that that's a bad action. It's going to make him cry. It's not great. But the person who's behind me, right, pushes me next because I pushed the kid and kills me, right? You're going to obviously think of me who pushed the kid as an action to be less worse than the person who was behind me that pushed me and ultimately killed me, right? Even though it was done just like justifiably, right? Because I pushed a kid, he or she got upset and pushed me, and ultimately led to my demise, right? So because we have these little different kind of standards, it means that you don't have that you value people differently, right? So that means certain actions are okay for some people, other actions are not okay for others.
Yeah.
That's where I think that the relativism really sets in.
And this is a point you and I did touch on a little bit in our days of slowly texting one another. This is I think, simply a definitional disagreement that we need to clear up, because saying an action is absolutely true is absolutely immoral, rather, would mean that in all cases it's immoral to push somebody, right? It's absolutely immoral. To say something is objectively immoral is to mean that in that one case, it is 100% immoral to push them. Not in every case, that's absolutely immoral, but in one case that we're talking about, and there's going to be an infinite number of cases, in this case, it is 100% immoral to do it in that case. So then, with those definitions in mind, I'm not saying that individual actions like pushing someone, for example, is absolutely immoral. Because you're right, we could think of a lot of cases where the act of pushing someone is not absolutely immoral. Maybe you push them backwards off of a ledge they were going to accidentally fall off of, right? Well, that doesn't mean it's absolutely immoral to push somebody. But you could say, all else equal, right, without any confounding variables, it was objectively moral to push that person off of that ledge they were going to accidentally fall off of. You couldn't absolutely say it, because it wouldn't apply in every case, but you could objectively say it for that one case.
So this is where the interesting statement comes in. You ready? So the thing is that moral absolutism does not exist. It's if you say something is objective, it means that it's objective in all cases, right? So that means you can't really use this is objectively true as a blanket statement. You can only really say that in case-by-case situations. You can't just say objectively murder is wrong, because you can't really use it as a blanket statement, because there's obviously some instances where murder is permissible. That's where I think that you can't really use. There's no such thing as like absolutism. There's that doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is objective morality, right? Where it's where that instance, sure, you can say objectively that was wrong, but you can't use objective as a blanket statement, and that's where relativism comes in.
And we actually agree on that. So I think there's more nuance to unpack here, because it sounds like we agree on those terms, that right, objective actually wouldn't apply to all cases, and that seems to break down my argument. But here's my point about that, since we seem to be on the same page. Because it doesn't apply in all cases does not mean it can't apply in any number of cases. And to unpack that, because it sounds really confusing, let's just say killing someone, because this is going to be an edge case. It's going to have less less cases of being, in my view, moral, but it could happen, right? So you could say neither of us could say it's absolutely immoral to kill. We agree on that. But where I would say, if you're going to kill somebody, and that somebody is an innocent person you don't know, and there's going to be no positive side effects, no one's well-being is better, nothing positive happens from it, then in that case, you could say not that it's absolutely immoral to kill, because you're right, we could not say it as a blanket statement, but you could say in that case, and then you could do this for any number of cases, it is objectively immoral to kill in that case. Not to kill in every case, but in that case, you could say it's objectively immoral. And then you would just have to do that across whatever instance you're talking about. If you're talking about pushing someone, it's not absolutely immoral to push someone, but if it's all else equal just to save their life and they were going to unintentionally die, then you could say it's objectively moral to push that person, not absolutely moral, because you're right, the blanket statement wouldn't apply.
So actually, this kind of brings me to a question. I think we actually talked about this, but this is kind of the point where I'm just like, if you want to be someone who wants to be objective morality or believes in objective morality, right? You have to be extremely specific for this reason, right? It's because you can't really use those blanket statements. You can't really just say murder's objectively wrong, because there are some instances where you could argue that it is right or morally permissible. And in this case, right, I think that you can argue that the action itself of just killing an innocent bystander, right, by itself, right, without knowing that person, and just shooting that person just out of the blue randomly, that is objectively morally wrong. You would have to say, even in the case like that person just happened to be like a serial killer, it's still wrong. That action still had to be wrong. Sure, it might have had so for example, let's just say I walk into a grocery store, first person I see, I shoot, right? Just like out of the blue, weird coincidence. It happens to be a famous serial killer that's killed like hundreds of people. Does the action still mean that it's bad? Now, the consequentialist view, which is basically saying that if an action results in a positive outcome, then that action is morally permissible. And that's where it's really hard to kind of defend objective morality as a consequentialist, because you believe that the means justify the ends regardless, right? But someone who believes in objective morality, you would have to say that the action, just shooting someone by itself, even if it was just a mass murder or there was a positive outcome to it, is still bad.
Well, no, you wouldn't. If you thought it was absolutely wrong to murder, right? Then you...
Well, no, but like the action itself, if you're just judging the action itself, like you would still, so in that case, I would also argue it would be morally impermissible, because you just went and shot a random person, right? Sure, the outcome might have been good, but that action itself was bad. Therefore, in that sense, I would say objectively it is wrong to go into a grocery store and kill someone.
I hear what you're saying, right? And here's the difference in how this is being defined. It's not that actions are inherently good or bad. It's kind of like how in their day-to-day life, someone like yourself would say, well, no, there's cases where that's not true. We actually agree on that, because I'm not saying that you go in and you shoot somebody, that's a problem. You could certainly make that case if you wanted. That would be the most, fundamental, I would call that deontological. You might call that value ethic, however you define that best. But under those philosophical views, that would be unacceptable. I'm not actually subscribing to one of those views. What I'm saying is this. If you go in and you shoot somebody, regardless of your intentions, what is the well-being effect, right? What is the promotion or reduction of harm? What actually are you affecting in the world? It's similar to consequentialism in some sense. And then you would say, okay, actually killing a murderer, while generally speaking shooting someone is wrong, I wouldn't say it's absolutely wrong, because you have hence increased or at least stopped the reduction of well-being from that person being able to murder 100 more people, right? So you have now done something that was objectively better than shooting the other person in the store, because you could have shot the person standing next to the murderer. And then if you're someone who would say, oh, well, murder's wrong, then in that worldview, both murders are equally wrong. I'm not even saying that. I'm saying that shooting the random old lady in the grocery store who is innocent and spends her day, putting books in her local library, that shooting that woman is objectively worse than shooting the mass murderer, regardless of whether or not shooting is viewed as absolutely ethical.
Here's the thing, right? Again, there's no such thing as moral absolutism, right? It's just objective morality. So that means you're a relativist, right? You believe that morality is relative based on the outcome, right? If you wanted to say that an action was morally objectively wrong, right, you would have to say in all instances, regardless of outcome, it has to be bad, right? But because you said since the outcome actually was good, therefore it's relative to the outcome. So therefore, you're a moral relativist.
It's disagreement in terms again. I'm not saying absolutely. I'm saying objectively in that case. That's the distinction.
So, the thing is, you would say that just killing an innocent so that means you'd have to get even more specific, right, to defend that action is objectively morally wrong, right? Is that you have to go over and say a decent person, you just randomly shoot them, that's objectively wrong, right? That's very easy to say. But as soon as you kind of just broaden it just a little bit, where you're just oh, you just go into a random grocery store and you shoot the first person that you see is objectively wrong. Then you have to say, regardless of outcome, then it is objectively wrong. Then you would have to be oh, even if it's a positive outcome, yeah, it's still objectively wrong because you still shouldn't have done that, period, right?
Well, I'm not saying that. So that's actually just not what I'm saying.
Right. I'm just saying that's how you would have to if you broaden that sentence up a little bit. Now, if you went over and looked at I think that the better alternative is from instead of looking at actions, instead looking at outcomes, because I feel like that would be a easier way for you to defend objective morality, right? Is saying in the outcome that you shoot and kill someone, right? That person is an innocent person versus someone who's a mass murderer. It's obviously morally more permissible to shoot the mass murderer than the innocent person, right? So you would have to specifically look at outcomes and or be more broad with the statement of actions for you to be able to defend objective morality. Other than that, you have to be a relativist in every sense.
Well, I actually, up to this point, and maybe I haven't made that clear, been largely talking about outcomes. The outcome of well-being, increase, decrease, stay the same. I actually have been talking outcomes in the same way that the outcome of how your diet affects your health, right? To tie back into that parallel. It's not about whether or not eating a Snickers bar is inherently unhealthy, because how do we know if it's unhealthy? Because the outcome is based on some set of intuitive ideas of what health means. I'm actually saying the same thing, that it's immoral to shoot somebody, not simply because the action, but because of these set of, easily understood intuitive facets of our objective morality, I would call it, that we're learning more and more about. That actually is how I'm defining it. It is largely outcome-oriented. It is result-oriented. If well-being is being absolutely demolished, if you're enslaving people, it's not that the act of enslaving someone is inherently wrong per se, although I think you can make the jump to that. Secondly, primarily you have to first start with, to your point, why. And the why is because you are causing harm, you are causing degradation to a culture, to individuals, you are reducing their ability to have a happy and successful life. Right? These are all, in your words, outcomes. I think that's a fair depiction of what I'm saying.
Right. But here's the issue with that, right? That means you can't say an action or a specific thing is objectively morally right or wrong, right? You can't, like with that viewpoint, you can't say that objectively slavery is wrong, because there are some instances where slaves were belonged to a very nice household, right? They got 3 meals a day that was way better than they were getting before. They weren't beaten as much as possible, and that they were given a place to sleep. They were with their family, right? And it caused a net increase of an outcome, right? If there was enough of those types of households, would slavery be permissible?
Are you saying if people who were enslaved were treated well enough, then would it be
better
permissible?
off than how they originally started off, right? Let's say, that they were given an allowance, they had a nice bed, they had the ability to have some leisure time, and objectively, they can view that their previous life was way worse than the life that they're living now. Would slavery be permissible in that sense?
That's a really good point. And there's 2 thoughts on that. One, at a certain point of treating someone well enough, then you could say that they're no longer enslaved. But within the but framework,
no, like they're still enslaved if they belong to someone,
sure,
and they are forced to stay in that property.
Right. So within
they
that
cannot
framework,
just go out and be willy free, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is the term of slavery. But if you make slavery appealing, right, does that make slavery permissible?
Right. So here's where the nuance comes in, which, to your point earlier, I agree with. In the same way that health is more than just longevity of life, morality is more than just pain. It's also opportunity. There's lots of facets of what could make something moral. Now, if you're enslaved, by definition, you don't have full bodily autonomy, for example. You don't have access to other jobs. You can't get promoted. You probably can't have a loving relationship with someone of a different race than you, right? So these are all things that, while, yes, I actually, I hear your point, they're not causing you pain. Maybe you're in a 5-star hotel equivalent and you only pick crops twice a day, and say it's the 21st century, you get to play Xbox the other 22 hours a day. Well, calling it slavery is a little bit of a stretch, but definitionally correct. So I see your point. But now you've lost autonomy. Isn't that also something that's important to humans? Isn't that one other piece?
What if you willingly gave up that autonomy, right, for that increase in well-being? Would that still, it's like one of my professors and one of my philosophy professors put this perfectly. He's like, what if you were able to give up your right to vote, right? That would decrease your autonomy, right, of being able to choose who's in the next election. Instead you could gain like money, right? And so then you have financial freedom for the rest of your life. So you give up a little bit of autonomy to gain something, right? And so if you were, if to go back to the slavery example, right? If you had to give up some of your bodily autonomy to live the life of your dreams, right? And you willingly traded that, does that make slavery permissible?
And that's a really fun example. 2 comments. One, again, talking objective, case by case, absolute, not umbrella absolute in all cases. And 2, the fun thing about that question, because I thought about similar questions, and they're really interesting. It's a similar vein of thought to something like consent or what have you. The one problem with that is you have the right to choose to be enslaved, to choose to not vote, but you lose the right to choose to go back to having the ability to vote. You lose the ability to return to your previous state, which in some sense is already a degradation. Now, it was a degradation that you chose. That's just why adding more 13 to this PG again. Consent's a great example. The Supreme Court ruled that you cannot give consent if you are not conscious or if you're not awake, because you have no ability to change your mind back. You can't say, oh yeah, you can do what you want. Oh, but actually I changed my mind. You lose that ability, right? So yes, these edge cases are interesting and certainly have nuances to them. But while yes, you chose the money, you can't choose to get it back, to answer your question.
Right. So I guess I see where you're coming from, where, even like, sure, you might be able to agree to the terms now and then, regret it later. But the end of the day, you made that choice, just like how you can choose to be a smoker, right? You can choose to, you can choose to gamble your life savings away, right? You can make terrible choices, but does that make gambling itself bad? Does that make smoking or just like the act of smoking itself bad? No, it's not the choice that dictates. It's it's how the outcome generally is, right? The reason why smoking is bad is because you get a lot of health defects, right? The reason why some people say that gambling is bad is because it's highly addictive and can be extremely costly to one's well-being because of the lack of ability of choice. But if you're able to make the choice itself, right, in a reasonable capacity, right, you sign a contract with full consent, right, as a rational human being, and you're like, I would much rather give my life away because I'm living in poverty now, and I'd much rather just not, have my autonomy to go wherever I want, then you've made that choice. You can't go back on it because you were given the full length of the contract, right?
Right, and this is where I think our dialogue has helped me clarify the way I want to say this. Although I can't say my view has changed yet, but to the point about slavery, because it's a good one. This is an extension of a point I made earlier. I actually agree with you. It sounds like that. I can't absolutely say slavery is immoral. So it's probably a fair reading of what I'm trying to say. But I can say you have to look at it case by case, and then if you want to aggregate and generalize, you can certainly do that. Same with health, right? You can't say broccoli's always healthier. That's fair to say. I agree. Okay, slavery is immoral. And then if you want to add an asterisk or an earmark and say, except in cases where someone is better off being enslaved and had full consent and had full autonomy, and it doesn't get passed down to their children and reduce their children's well-being, right? You could add these asterisks, and I actually agree with that. There could be an instance where you are not technically enslaved, but you are just beat up all day by your spouse, just brutal domestic abuse. And for years and years and years, and in this hypothetical world, someone comes along and says, you can technically be my slave, but I'll treat you better and X, Y, and Z, your example. Yeah, I mean, I would say that is more moral, that the life, right, that she's living, that she's being treated more morally by that second person. You could probably make that argument. I actually agree with you there. So you couldn't say absolutely slavery is bad, but you can say in almost every case it's objectively immoral because the other options are better. I mean, that's a pretty easy, accurate statement to say. But yeah, you could make that case, sure.
So what a lot of objective, what a lot of people do who believe in objective morality is that they say, in general, right, slavery is bad. And that just says that in most cases, right, that's how that is. But they never say morale or slavery is objectively wrong, because they always have to add the in general part, because there are some of those cases where you might have some insane uh, like example that might actually prove that statement wrong,
Sure.
right? So that's why you have to add the in general part, because you can't just say it as a blanket statement of saying, yeah, objectively slavery is wrong, because there are some instances where that is okay. um
Sure. And I agree. You can't say it absolutely, but in almost every case, you could say it's objectively better than, whatever the other alternative is, right? If you're looking at a decision point, it's really a lot easier at inflection points. If you're looking at a point between something that appears to have just two outcomes, right? Should I do path A or path B? And path A is not being a slave legally, but being punched in the face every second for the rest of my life. And path B is technically being a slave legally, but having a really happy life, but I lose my autonomy. Yeah, okay, B probably increases well-being the most. I mean, I actually, hopefully from the beginning, haven't ever implied that that's not the case. If so, then I've misspoke. Because I would never say absolutely. You're right in saying you can't absolutely say slavery is wrong. You also can't absolutely say pushing someone is wrong. That's just a less extreme example. But in the case where you're stopping someone from accidentally falling off a cliff, you've increased well-being. So it is objectively true in that case. That doesn't mean that the action is absolutely true in all cases.
right. And so that's where, like, in cases where it's like, slavery, you can say, or like most people who believe in objective morality say that in general slavery is objectively wrong, right? I i
Sure.
feel like there are definite, like, cases of other things, such as, like, that would be seen as bad, such as, like, sacrificial you know regiments, right? There are some cases of people sacrificing one of their village members so that way that they get a string of luck. Sometimes that's very important to what the tribe believes, and sure, that might be what, as onlookers we might be able to impose our own morals to say that is objectively wrong, but that is, I believe, forcing a little bit of our own moral standards onto someone else, and that's where I kind of deviate away from objective morality, right? Sure, I can definitely say that with my own moral compass, I can say that I believe that slavery is wrong, right? I can't speak for the person that actually does slavery or is a slave, right? I can't speak for them, right? And that's where I'm more of a moral relativist, because I feel like morality is relative based on the culture, right?
So it sounds like you're saying, and maybe I'm reading this too narrowly. It sounds like you're saying that you have more of an issue with how something like an objective morality is implemented than its actual premises. Because for me, I have no problem looking at another belief system and saying if it's objectively, immoral in some way. I have no problem with that. There's no piece of me that is worried about offending. I mean, if there's minor deviation, then maybe offense plays a role. But if you're talking major deviation, where yeah, this culture thinks it's okay to kill their second born kid because of a mythical belief that they have passed down, and they might believe it wholeheartedly. I mean, people believe Christianity wholeheartedly or Islam wholeheartedly, no problem. But even if they believe it wholeheartedly, I'm not going to have any personal problem with offending them, because objectively speaking, some actions are going to be worse. So am I hearing you right in saying that it's actually just the implementation that's the problem?
It's mostly an implementation for me, because I feel like, as someone who's not participating in the culture, someone who hasn't surrounded themselves in the culture, and as someone who's not the one being affected by that action being imposed by that culture, I can't really have a say into what they are thinking is right or wrong. And the other part of the of objective morality is that it, people's that people's definition of objective morality, right? The things that they say that are objectively wrong or right, varies from person to person, right? There's no, like, everyone has their own definition of their truth, right? So, like, for example, someone might say it's objectively wrong to litter, like it hurts the planet. Other people might say that objectively they don't care, right? And so that's kind of the other issue that I have with objective morality, is that the fact that it varies from person to person, and the implementation leads to some very harmful things.
Well, let me hit that point right there then, because what I'm talking about wouldn't vary. The variation, if someone, just because someone says the Earth is flat, doesn't mean it's flat. Just because someone says, "Oh, this is the absolute," this is.
Then
the
how do we know it's
truth.
objectively morally right or wrong?
Well, again, this goes back to.
But besides, like, because some people might view that harm as good. You might have a facet of whether or not that harm means something, right? That maybe from what you can observe, right, as like an onlooker, you can be like, oh, that the way that person was treated inflicted pain, or had a decrease in well-being in that action, right? But someone who is actually a participant in that scenario might say otherwise. So therefore, there is no really set standard, right? And that's where my issue comes in.
And to that point, let's use pain as an example, because pain is one of the pieces
facets of
yeah, and it sounds like you understand what I'm saying there. To your point about pain, well, in that instance, it doesn't matter who's looking on, because pain is a wholly intrapersonal, subconscious experience. It's an intrapersonal experience, only experienced by that person, right? I can't look at you and say, how much pain are you feeling? So in that case, there is no problem. There's no, oh, but the onlooker thinks that person's in more pain. It doesn't matter what the onlooker thinks. What matters is how much pain they're actually in.
But how do we know that? How do we know how much pain they're in? How do we know if there is a decrease or an increase in well-being?
I agree with you. That's one of the great questions, and that's my point. We are in the early stages of this journey of uncovering the cement under the floorboard. Because I'm sure someone hundreds of years ago said, but how do we know the Earth is round? I could drop a pencil, and your theory says that it's gravity pulling it to the center. My theory is that we're a disk and we're going upwards through air resistance, and it's pushing it down, right? You can say that. And then the fascinating question now is, okay, if we accept this premise that this person's experiencing pain, how do we know how much pain it is? That's a fascinating question, and I agree. I don't have an answer as an onlooker. Only the person feeling it knows. But to say,
then how would an onlooker know whether an action is right or wrong if determining an action was right or wrong? Because usually, well, what humans do is that we learn by observing others, right? If we see that someone is getting whipped for a certain action, we're going to try to stay away from that action, as we do not want to be in the pain that it looks like the other person is performing, right? So as an onlooker, how do you determine if an action is right or wrong?
Yeah, and well, pain is just one facet, but to use this facet as an example, it's fair to say that we don't know if that person would be experiencing pain that's a 6 or a 6.5 out of 10, right? We agree, we have no idea. Maybe someday we will, and that's a really fascinating, neuroscientific discovery that would be, and that I'm sure would be very far down the road. But even if you don't want to assume that that's possible, although I think it certainly is, well, you could tell for a lot of ways. You can look at the fact that someone's screaming in agony, right? If they're screaming in agony, okay, well, I know they're in pain. I might not know if it's an 8 or a 10, but I know it's worse than a 0, right? So you can make these comparisons. I know if I tickle someone, they're not screaming in agony. So at least on the pain scale, I know objectively it's less painful. I don't know if it's 5 points less painful. I don't know if it's 10 points less painful, because you and I agree that the quantifiability of morality is, you might say impossible. I would say very difficult and very far out in the future. But even if we can't define it, it doesn't mean there's not ways to read it. And, someone crying that they're in pain is a great example of that.
What about like different types of, like, it's easy to kind of like dictate with one facet, but what if you're trying to compare multiple different facets? Like, for example, let's say like we're trying to prove that the fact that stealing is objectively wrong, right? And let's say the person steals the purse, right? And let's say, as punishment, they have their hand chopped off. Now, who did the most morally bad action? Was it the person? Was it me stealing, or was it the person that was cutting my hand off? Because obviously, I'd be screaming in agony if my hand was cut off, but the person who had their stuff stolen from them wouldn't be screaming in agony, but rather have a sad expression and say, that sucks.
Yeah, and that's a really, really interesting point. Two thoughts. The first, again, I'm not actually trying to say that stealing is objectively wrong. It'd be stealing
I'm just saying, like,
in that case.
In that case.
Right. So just to clarify that. But then to your actual question, that's a really great question. Again, I don't know that I have the calculator that will do that calculus. Just like someone 2,000 years ago doesn't have the telescope to measure how round the Earth is. It doesn't mean the Earth's not round. It doesn't, and then in this case, it doesn't mean that an action isn't a higher aggregate morality score, to put it quantifiable, because I know that makes more sense to our minds. Just because we don't have any way yet to decide these gray area cases, right? Because there's always going to be edge cases. Well, if you want to play a hypothetical game, which I like doing, and say, well, there's going to be certain edge cases, I'd say, yeah, you're right. I don't know exactly how to measure these edge cases. But even if we don't know exactly how round the Earth is, day to day, we know that the Earth is round. So in the same way, day to day, stealing's not generally moral. That chopping someone's hand off is not generally morable. How do you compare, right? How precisely can you measure the grayest of edge cases? I don't have a good answer for you. But that doesn't mean that A, we won't find an answer, or B, that just because we don't have an answer doesn't mean an answer doesn't exist.
So what about the situations where, let's take abortion, for example. Some people say that, abortion is exactly like murder, and the other says that it's an atomic choice of autonomy. How do we determine if that's moral or not?
Yeah, well, I actually think abortion's one that I think we tend to overlook some pretty obvious indicators that, I don't know if my cynical mind tells me it's for political reasons. With Roe v. Wade being overturned today, maybe that's where my mind is. But there's lots of ways. For example, to give you my thoughts on abortion and then kind of expand from there. Third trimester abortion. Say you're 9 months pregnant and you aborted a baby, which is very rare. I don't know, very few places it's legal, if anywhere. But theoretically, that would be an abortion. I view a 9-month pregnant abortion exactly the same as a preemie infanticide, right? Because there's no actual difference in the psychological development of the baby, right? There's no difference there. And you might say, well, how do you define that if you think it's immoral? Well, I would say it's immoral because well-being is harmed. The baby's well-being, which I'm not a neuroscientist, but I think some semblance of well-being doesn't start to exist until after the first trimester. So, like, for example, first trimester abortions, I don't have a spiritual inclination that there is a soul necessarily in a 1 day old embryo. I don't have that personal view, so I don't have any problem if you're aborting that because it's not harming the baby. Now, you could make cases that sometimes even those abortions are wrong because it actually ends up hurting the mom and it hurts her relationships and she does it somewhere that's unsanitary, right? There are plenty of cases that even that could be wrong. But if you want to just talk, day to day, generally speaking, without getting too nitty gritty, you could say, yeah, well, there's no consciousness of a baby first trimester. There definitely is something equivalent to a newborn infant, third trimester, and second trimester, we don't know yet. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but like here's the thing is that it's such a gray area, right? Where, we can obviously argue whether a mother's is like, because the main premise here is that you're eliminate the like it's you're have two alternatives basically, right? One, you get the autonomy of the woman to be able to have a kid, right? And forego the pain of childbirth, or B, right? You essentially eliminate the opportunity for an embryo to become a human, right? And live a life, right? So I would say you're having a crossroads between two different well-beings. Now, which one do you dictate as more important?
Yeah, well, I see your point. I would change it slightly in my own words because I don't see an embryo having well-being in this sense, but not to totally miss your point. You're right. It is an interesting balance between two. Let's just say, and tell me if this is a bad understanding of your question. Comparing a woman's autonomy with an 8.5 month pregnant baby that could be aborted. Like, these are just two human lives. Is that kind of your question? How do you judge which is more important?
Right.
Okay. Well, I would judge it in this way. Not because I'm not going to count embryos, because then it gets even more interesting, but more difficult to understand. If you're looking at a woman's life, the option is, okay, she loses autonomy over her body. What's the baby's option? It loses its life. Now, in the same way that we view health, which is worse, morbid obesity or eating a donut one time, but you're an otherwise healthy person? Well, both are bad actions. I mean, we could both say they're both not healthy things to do. And I would say both would be immoral things to do in some sense. They're both negative to well-being. However, ending a life, and we all can intuit this, I don't know anyone who wouldn't, in the same way we can intuit health, ending a life capable of well-being, a conscious life, right, is worse objectively than someone feeling like they lose autonomy over part of their body and part of someone else's body, because at that point the baby is its own entity as well. So one is obviously more harmful than the other one is in terms of well-being harm, if you will, well-being reduction, to use that language.
Okay, so I think the thought exercise kind of missed the point that I was trying to get at. So let me try to strike you for another.
Sure.
So let's say we have a fully grown woman and a month-old, baby, right? We have the trolley dilemma, right? The trolley's going and it has to run over one of the tracks, and you have to pick out one of the outcomes. So which would be most morally impermissible? Me killing the baby or me killing the mother? Or not the mother, just like a random woman.
Right. And here's my point about objective morality that maybe I didn't get across very well. In extreme edge cases or extreme gray areas, right, where you're right to say we don't have perfect measurements of these things, right? Pain, potential for social productivity, happiness, all of these things, right? We don't have an exact measurement for most, if not almost any of these things. You're right. The point is, I'm okay with saying I don't know, because in that case, I might not know if one is worse than the other. Maybe they're not, right? We just view them as close enough equal to say they're just about equal, and we don't have enough ability to measure to care. Kind of like, let's say like this. Is the Earth, let's look at this. Is the Atlantic Ocean 1,000 miles or 1,001 miles wide? I know it's neither of those, but just hear me out. Well, the best scientists in the world could say, we don't have the tools to delineate quite that closely, right? We don't know, to answer your question, which path is more moral, because they're really close. They both seem like they could be problematic options, either path on the track, action or inaction. They're very close, and that's an interesting conversation. But we know somewhere out there is an actual distance of the ocean, right? Somewhere is a distance. So that's my first point, is that even if you don't know, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And secondly, and I only mentioned this briefly, I think, in this conversation, you can have two equivalent options, right? It doesn't, and that's why I delineate between saying an action is absolutely wrong, because you could have equal options. For example, am I going to have a turkey sandwich on wheat bread or a ham sandwich on white bread? The macros, in theory, could even out, and your health would be equivalently affected, right? Well, in a similar vein, two actions that are seemingly not exactly the same, right? They're not identical. One of them's killing a baby, one of them's killing a woman. We can't yet measure their pain. We can't yet measure their happiness, the well-being of those people around us. And even if we could, they might be the same. And that's okay. That's my point. So the actions themselves don't have to have an absolute moral or immoral value. But regardless, there is a best or multiple best options. And that's why I'm inclined to be drawn to someone like Sam Harris's Landscape, where it's, is it more ethical to kill a murderer or kill a rapist who only murders sometimes? Well, there's going to be some answer, and maybe the answers are the same. Maybe they're equally immoral or moral actions, but that's okay. I have no quarrel with saying that certain cases will have equal actions of moral implication, if you will.
So that's let me try one more thought exercise, and then I'll drive my point home.
Sure.
And that hopefully will help you realize why I reject the premise of that morality is objective.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that there's two men, right? Both the same age, both the same health. They're going to live the same amount of time, right? One is a doctor and one is a homeless beggar. You have to choose one. Which one do you kill?
You mean under like my worldview, which one is more moral to kill, basically?
Which one would be, the least morally impermissible to kill?
Well, your intuition will tell you probably the doctor. But again, to your point, I can't measure this, and that's close enough of a comparison to say I don't know. That's my point. Is I have no problem saying we can't measure it. You know.
The thing is that initial response is the answer that I was looking for, right? As soon as you start saying that, you should kill the beggar, right? Then you immediately put a different value system on life.
Mm-hmm.
So that means regardless of how they live their life, how they contribute to society really gives them the value of their life. And so therefore, it means that the harms of the doctor outweigh the harms of the beggar, making human life unequal, meaning that if I, killed a beggar, that would be more morally permissible than me killing a doctor if I just randomly shot someone.
Potentially. Not necessarily. Not absolutely, because we don't have the...
No, I'm just saying, just at face value, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know anything else, right? That would be the answer through your lens.
If you're only measuring that one thing, which I already say you're not going to measure just one.
It's going to be so much more harm with the doctor gone than the beggar, right? But you are doing the same action to the same type of person. The only difference is how they contribute to society.
Let's take a more extreme case then. Which is worse? You tell me. And I would say this is objective, but maybe you disagree with me. You're stuck comparing it doesn't have to be a doctor or a beggar. It could just be a construction worker. It doesn't matter. An average person, right? Just an average person living their life. And then you're stuck with Hitler, right? Imagine Hitler's alive. Let's go extreme to make it easy here.
Right.
And you have to shoot someone. So you've now made a premise that you have to shoot somebody. Well, who are you going to shoot? Well, you might say murder is immoral, but it's obviously more moral to shoot Hitler. Now, in the real world practice, once you get down to people that are very similar, right? A beggar and a doctor are just two people who are potentially equally moral people. One might have a higher education, higher levels of opportunity, more access to upper level, academics and all these kinds of things. But in terms of their moral actions, have they done anything that harms the people around them, right? You can still weigh those two, but they're going to be close enough that, to your point, without being able to measure precisely the pain, the benefit, and so on and so forth, that, okay, in practice, this is close enough that we say this is a no-go zone, right? Because we have to also think not just philosophically, but practically. Look at politics. How are we going to implement an objective morality, right?
So I think you kind of shot through my point there, where my issue isn't just the action itself, but the fact that your value system, right, your lens of looking at the well-being of a person, right, has a numeric system that increases and decreases with people, right? Meaning that some people have more worth and some people have less worth, right? That's the issue that I have, where it means that your value system cares about people over others.
Sure, yeah, and I think that's actually a fair statement. In cases like the doctor and the homeless person, they're going to be almost identical because killing them is going to be some large amount of harm, of loss of well-being, that is going to be so similar that in practice we're going to ban it, let's say as a government, right? Let's say the government's based in an objective landscape, they're going to be almost identical because they're both just decent people. One just had more education, was able to be a doctor. You might say the doctor's, a minute level more moral because they've had more moral actions, and fine, you can make that argument. But to your point, yeah, I agree with your depiction of what I'm saying, that some people are worth less in some sense, because yeah, I would say Hitler is worth less than your good neighbor, right? Absolutely. I mean, I shouldn't say absolutely because as an adjective here, but objectively speaking, as an adjective, I fully think that's the case. Yeah, Hitler is more worthy of being killed than your neighbor is, your average neighbor, right? I actually agree with that.
And even though, you took like an extreme case, my issue is when we start, when we start kind of going down a little bit in terms of extremism, right? Like, for example, if you want to talk about innate harm, right, and well-being, you innately value humans more than any other being on the planet, right?
You asking me in particular?
Yes.
I value the capacity for experiencing well-being. Right now, it seems like humans have the most capacity to do that, but I'm going to guess like chimpanzees are not very far behind. Dolphins are probably not very far behind them.
Actually, it's cows and pigs that are the closest to us neurologically.
Interesting.
They have the capability to actually feel empathy, to feel pain, and they have the similar social structures that we do, where we fall into similar social groups. The dolphins do actually similar things, but it would be like the equivalent of, killing a whole bunch of dolphins to eat food. That would be morally impermissible in your world view, because they have that well-being that is tangibly showing that it is wrong to kill those animals. Yet so many people eat red meat, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that would mean if I was using your lens scope, then I would say that every single person who eats red meat is morally impermissible, right?
Well, if you were basing it solely on that one point, kind of like pain, like the pain of the dolphin.
So but no, agree. But if it's scientifically proven that they feel a similar pain structure as we do, right? Then is cannibalism moral?
Well, I actually agree with your premise here, because I've actually been quite compelled by veganism for this exact reason. That, yeah, if we can prove, and we are increasingly able to do this, although with some distinctions, that certain animals, particularly mammals, have a capacity for well-being. Therefore, let's just start at extreme cases. Factory farming is disgusting and immoral. I agree. I mean, I actually don't disagree with that claim. So you and I might agree there.
But so many people, like actually, we're in the minority in that sense, right?
Sure.
So does that mean we are two moral people living in an immoral world?
Well, again, kind of like the actions. Those actions themselves are a level of immoral. Now, you also would have to then weigh the livelihood of that person, right? Because we evolved evolutionarily to eat other animals, and that allows us to survive and have a level of well-being.
The issue is that the descendants of or the ancestors of cows and pigs, right, were animals that we couldn't even kill on our own, right? We like the thing is that omnivores, right, can eat plants and meat for survival reasons because they have a lack of, vegetables to eat, or vice versa, right? With humans, right, we were known to primarily eat fruits and vegetables because meat was such a rarity. But now we have an excessive access to both, right? And so we're going up against our nature as omnivores by eating meat.
I'm actually going to probably say what you're trying to get me to say, but say it sincerely, because yes, I would say it's more moral to be a vegan in comparison to being someone who just eats factory farmed meat. That's an easy edge case. You could bring that in closer and say it's more moral to eat bugs than it is to eat pigs, right? You can keep bringing those two lines in, the goalposts. But in the most extreme case, I agree with you. Like, veganism is a more moral diet than factory farmed meat, just to look at the edges. I actually agree. So if you're trying to get me to say that, I am saying it wholeheartedly.
But the thing is that so many people. So the issue that I have is that the people who use your value system, right, can have very problematic worldviews because they don't view animals on the same level as humans, right? It goes right back to my point of slavery, right? Where it's like some, slave owners do not do not see the innate harms that they're causing onto slaves. So using your worldview of well-being, their point total, right, if you had to put it on a numeric system, are valued significantly less, right? So no matter how much harm they're feeling, if you're just choosing to ignore it, using your worldview, you can argue that slavery is morally permissible. And that is the reason why I strongly reject the premise of your worldview.
Well, here's the difference. Here's the distinction. And this goes back to my delineation I'm trying to make about perception versus actuality, about is the earth round versus do we know it's round.
But
just because someone says, I believe in objective morality, right? Let's say I was saying that to you right now, and I was saying it, but I don't care about the well-being of other animals. Then all they've done is move the goalposts. They're just not actually doing what they're saying they're doing. They might say, I value well-being. I value keeping, creatures like us humans alive and keeping us well and happy and not harmed, and then only eat meat. And then either one of two things will happen. They'll have to say, I'm being immoral and accept that they're not perfectly moral, which I have done several times. I do it regularly, right? For economic reasons, for other reasons, I'm not perfectly moral. Or we have to accept that they are incorrectly using the worldview they espouse, which are both possible.
See, yeah, but the thing is that I think we've finally gotten to like full circle here where objective morality, right, can't be objective because A, we have different value points for people, and B, we have no way of knowing what's the objective moral truth, right? The people who, did slavery did not understand that it was bad in any capacity. So there's no way to know, right, using your worldview, whether something is right or wrong. There might be some moral truth behind the curtain, but there's no way of us knowing, right? So you can't go over and say that something is...
Well, hold on. That's two questions. If you admit there's a moral truth behind the curtain,
I'm
And
saying
that means it's possible.
if there is a moral truth behind the curtain, because
Hmm.
if there is a moral truth, we definitely don't know it, right?
We don't know it perfectly, but we definitely know pieces of it.
Well, sure, we might have pieces of the
Hmm.
puzzle, we might have little rips and holes through the curtain,
Right?
and there might be some grand moral truth, but the thing is that we don't know what's behind there, that metaphorical curtain.
I think we actually agree then, because this goes to the floorboard example. We only pulled up 2 out of the billion floorboards, but who says we can't pull up 3 or 4
My
or a
thing
100?
is that there's no way to reveal what's behind the curtain, if that makes sense. If there is something behind the curtain, there's no way that we can, tug on the curtains, pull it up, and see what's underneath. If there is,
We
right?
just said there were rips in it, so now you're giving me 2 answers here.
No, the thing is, I'm saying like if there is, there
Mm,
might be like some kind of these like puzzle pieces that you say that we can observe, right?
sure.
That point to this. That is purely hypothetical there. But my thing is, I believe that there isn't any moral truth to like be uncovered. There is no concrete under the floorboard, and that you know we're a, it's kind of like my belief with agnosticism, right?
Hmm.
Where me being agnostic, right? I believe that there might be a deity, but I don't know. And so the thing is that there might be a moral truth, but I don't know. And so I think it's so hard to say that something is objective because getting to that truth is almost impossible, right? If there is a way that to do it, we might discover that in the future. But as of right now, we have no idea of knowing what is objective. And that's my problem with your worldviews,
Hmm.
because how can you say that something is objectively wrong? Like, who knows? Maybe murder might be the most moral thing to do because humans are a plague on the planet, right? And that serial killers are the most moral, virtuous people in the world, and that was what was behind the curtain all along, right? But the thing is that we don't know.
See, well, it actually sounds like, and this might be a good stopping point because we've been going for a couple hours now, and this is really fun. So we might have to talk some more in the future. But it sounds like as much as we seem to have this core disagreement, my optimism tells me that somewhere in there is a theoretical agreement between us, but how that can be implemented, we view as very different. Like you might say this is impossible to implement, and I would say this can be implemented in this way. And I think that's actually our disagreement. And tell me if I'm wrong, but we might actually have a little bit of agreement in there.
Well, okay, so I think yes, sure, we can theoretically agree that there might be some moral truth. Again, I don't know if there's a moral truth. I don't I just don't know. My thing is, for now, since we don't know, right? I'm a moral relativist. That's my best way of saying do whatever the hell you want, uh, or believe whatever you want, because there is no moral truth to be observed right now, right? It's kind of like trying to pave way through a deserted land, right? There's nothing there. You have to build the foundation for your own moral compass
Mm-hmm.
because there is nothing right now, right? Eventually you can start uncovering stuff and find the moral truth that tells us everything. But as of right now, we have no way of knowing. Sure, we might have puzzle pieces, but who knows? Maybe that might just be leading us in the opposite direction of where we need to go. My issue, right, with your worldview is that it the way that it has been implemented before has done a lot of harm, right?
Sure.
Think about like because there's a lot of people who had a kind of like a similar worldview that moved to America and then tried to convert everyone to Christianity because they thought that was the moral thing to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where it's like by my objective moral standard, right, I'm imposing that onto you, right? Because this is the moral truth that we know, and so therefore everyone needs to follow this. That is where it's kind of like I don't know about how I don't know if this can be implemented morally, right? Because it's one thing to say it's objectively morally wrong to, kill someone, but then it's like it's morally objectively wrong to not believe in God, right? Like the way people kind of like twist and skew that worldview is what I have an issue with.
Yeah, and actually that might be another second conversation to have, because we would probably agree more in that conversation about how certain worldviews have been implemented. I would say incorrectly, but we could debate that.
I definitely agree that there's definitely some worldviews that have been implemented
Right. I think they're actually not implementing the worldview, but that point can be debated for sure. But we would actually agree that, yeah, I think practically implementing many of these worldviews will have been done horribly. I mean, whether because you base something on what a god has said or what a political leader has said or an ignorant understanding of reality, simply. I mean, we would probably agree on that. So that might be a fun conversation to have. But I think the only difference between us practically today, it seems, is that I think we have a lot more pieces of the puzzle than you think we do. I think that this foundational reality, if implemented honestly, right, not everything's based on well-being, but I'm going to say my well-being's better than yours, but actually intellectual, honest implementation of this practice, I think we have more pieces to the puzzle that we can intuit or even in some ways measure, or at least compare relative measurements of well-being of humans, of mammals, of so on and so forth. We definitely don't have all the pieces, but I think the distinction is, I would say we do have more pieces, and you would say we don't, and then that could be a disagreement and debate in its own self. Is that a fair representation?
Yes, because I think that the puzzle pieces that we do have currently are more of a cultural thing rather than an objective moral truth, where it's pointing towards like sociological behavior, where you see us participating in society, and something that goes against society is viewed as morally wrong, right? And so therefore it's objectively morally wrong in that culture, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from, at least.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I really think we understand fully. It took a minute, but I think we understand fully where the difference of opinion is, and if we ever want to talk some more, we can maybe unpack more specifically that difference of opinion rather than more high-level philosophy, and we could also unpack implementation of morals, because that's an entirely different conversation. That is fascinating. But yeah, so that was a really great conversation, and I'm really glad you're willing to have it with me, because I really fear that our lack of ability to have these kinds of conversations is going to hurt. It's going to hurt us. Should I say objectively, or will that be problematic?
I mean, I totally agree with you on that point. I think dialogue is the best way to objectively help society.
Sure.
But I definitely think there's some complex situations, and I kind of like playing two different sides, where I like to try to disprove things, even though I don't feel strongly either way, because at one point I felt like I was a little bit of a believer of objective morality, and I really took that to heart, because I was just like, there's just so many things that we can observe around us. Why isn't it objective? And I talked to this other guy, and he was just like, it's kind of like impossible. And I was like, oh, well, now I kind of see where you're going. But I definitely see where you're coming from. And I definitely really like having these conversations.
I do as well. I mean, you're not going to learn anything until you're exposed to new ideas. So I really appreciate the conversation. My guess, considering how fun at least this was for me, and it sounds like for you, we're going to have more of these conversations. So be on the lookout for that. But yes, thank you for talking with me, and this was wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you so much.